Thanks for tuning into the Replatform podcast sponsored by Ampli and Ciclavio. You're listening to myself, James Gerd, and the beautiful voice of my co-host, Paul Rogers. How are you today, buddy?
Yeah, good. Thanks. How are you doing?
Yeah, I'm all right. Although I am definitely realising now that I always, when we're doing these podcasts, I have the patio doors open for the dog, and now we're getting towards winter. It's a little bit colder in the office.
Yeah, I can imagine. Yeah, it's a lot colder this week than it was last week for sure.
It certainly is, hence the fleece today. Thanks to all of our regular listeners for tuning back in. We hope you enjoy this episode as well. And if you're new to the podcast, we appreciate you giving us a chance. We hope that we don't let you down and that you enjoy the content. And we'd love a like on YouTube, Spotify, Apple, make us feel much better about our own inadequacies. So let's set up the topic and then we'll get cracking. So today we're talking about by design, how to handle replatform projects when design and development are done by different agencies. So it's common for businesses to select an SI agency partner that will do both design and development. Or they provide all the resource, they do the end-to-end project management for you. It simplifies selection. However, there are projects when the client's specific needs and the level of design that they're looking for, I've seen this with luxury brands, I know you have, Paul, and the brand experience being a huge part of the project, not just a smaller part, means that actually the design skills and capabilities of the development partner aren't suitable for what that client needs. Therefore, they go to market and find a separate design partner. And this approach has its own pros and cons. So what we're going to talk about in this episode is the pros and cons for separating design and development, how you run an efficient design phase in this context, including like kickoff, briefing, and then aligning design with development, which is the critical requirement in this process. So before we start going into our usual questions and answers, Paul, it'd be useful for you to what's your perspective on this? Because you've come across this a few times. What normally drives people to separate out design?
Yeah, so I think there's a few different reasons. Like, I guess a lot of our clients are like premium or luxury fashion brands. I think there's a lot more those types of brands typically want to do this. Like, they'll often want like an independent specialist who maybe works with different fashion brands they kind of aspire to or, really like. And they'll kind of want to bring someone in to handle that part. And then they'll want like an additional kind of best in class development agency to then build, the front end and back end, depending on platform. As effectively as possible. But I think there's various reasons. So often people have this input already. So like we worked with a brand a couple of years ago, they have like an independent creative director, kind of like a fractional creative director, doing 1 to 2 days a week. So it's always going to happen. And there's often kind of relationships as well with these brands where people have used people for a long time. I think, the biggest reason usually is because the brand doesn't necessarily think the development agencies have the right skill set to deliver the scope of the design project. So, and as I said to you earlier, I think often when someone's bringing in a specialist or an independent to do a redesign, usually is a broader scope. So they're thinking more about like art direction and, like digital identity, and they're trying to build something that's more unique and kind of more about the brand than just a website. So I think that's often a goal. And I think there's definitely agencies that can do both sides to a really good level. But I think, when you work with a certain type of brand, they've also got like preconceptions. And I do agree with it quite often where there's a brand where they literally just want to have an isolated project that's focused on, I guess like their identity, their content, much broader than a standard like web redesign. And I think that's probably the biggest one.
Yeah, I think that the point you made about art direction is really important, because there's a difference between design and art direction and aligning a visual aesthetic with the brand concept and the brand values, so that there's a coherent story, which a lot of people who work in e-commerce who might be good at looking at what, interactions and how it works functionally in user journey won't understand that level of like brand design. Not everyone believes in that, but for those who do, it is very, very important. So you're right. So with that in mind, let's start getting into some of the areas. So number one, let's talk about the risks of separating out before we talk about the benefits. So a few for me is normally it's increased cost. If you get a specialist design partner, inevitably the cost of doing the design phase with them, it'll be slightly more involved. There'll probably be more iteration. It's going to be typically a big chunk of cash more than if you just do a design phase of the development agency, usually in the brackets of 10,000 plus additional cost in these projects. Then you've got the separation of two different agencies having to come together to deliver a cohesive project, and most of the agencies won't have worked together before, which means they don't have a process for that transition between design to development, which adds risk, which you need to mitigate around. And then the other one for me is that not all designers understand interaction design for e-commerce. They might be very good at visual design and brand design, but they might not understand how that design needs to translate into different breakpoints, into different devices, how people are using devices, and therefore how to make specific layouts work functionally as well as visually look fantastic. I've seen this in a jewelry company where visual designs look fantastic on paper, but they were just too large. Everything was so big that in a browser, it meant that hardly any usable content was visible within the screen, and it made so much browsing to get to call to actions or being able to use the content. So you realize that actually the blend of skills might not always be right in a separate design agency. So those are mine. What about yourself? What are the risks you've seen in separating it out?
Yeah, so I think the three biggest ones that I always think about, because we do have this discussion quite a lot. I think first one, as you said, is cost. So I think, it's always typically going to cost more. Not always, but it's usually going to cost more. Second one is the timeline. So it's always going to take more time if you do this properly. Like a design project, in my experience, is usually kind of 12 to 14 weeks. And then you would go into development. And I guess you need some level of crossover, which we'll come on to later on, and all of that kind of stuff. And then I think the third one is it becomes harder to manage. So I think, again, we'll probably talk a bit about, the next question is focused on benefits. And I think I'm a big fan of like decoupling areas of a replatforming project and bringing in different specialists, just because I think it can de-risk projects. But it does take a lot more management. If you've got a project manager, they're essentially working with, multiple project plans, and, there's multiple inputs into project plans, there's kind of more risks around kind of things being slowed down, et cetera, more kind of scopes that need to be managed. So they're kind of the biggest ones for me. But I mean, the other one, to be honest, the other really big one is occasionally you'll get, and I guess this comes down to briefing and setting parameters, but you'll often get designers that just fundamentally design outside of the capabilities of not only the ecom platform or like the whatever else is kind of influencing the front end, but also like the third parties or apps that you're working with as well, like for example search or back in stock or filtering or whatever else. And I guess that just comes back down to briefing correctly and making sure you've got the right kind of detail for them up front. But they're probably the biggest ones that I've seen.
Yeah, I think it's, and actually we'll come on to some of those things, especially around like third-party apps and constraints within the design process. We'll come on to that later when we talk about how you align dev partners with design agencies and getting the design brief fit for purpose. But let's flip. We've done the potential risk. What the benefit in your mind? What are the benefits of splitting this out and having a specialist design partner?
So I mean, the biggest one is typically the end product will probably end up being stronger from like a visual perspective. And I think the design will be more likely to like fully kind of encapsulate all of the content and, all of the things that a creative director would want to showcase. And yeah, I think nowadays, particularly there's so much competition, so many different like high volume D2C brands challenging everyone. I think I'm quite pro this, because I think when you do bring in like a truly kind of specialist brand focused like creative director or like that level of influence, I do think you end up with something that's a bit more like unique to your brand. So that's the biggest one. Yeah, and I think the process itself as well, like when you're working with a higher level of design input, I think is usually a bit stronger. Like maybe like the discovery sessions, maybe how they deal with certain stakeholders as well. The level of research they do around the brand. All of that kind of stuff. So I'd say they're probably my biggest pros, to be honest.
Yeah, I think so. I think that from what I've seen, and I haven't worked on as many projects as you where there's been a separate design partner, but I've certainly worked like 2 or 3 in the last 2 years. And the primary benefit I've seen is getting, when you've got a very like visually art direction led business with a creative director, or a very hands-on business owner who is all about the brand identity, the credibility in the eyes of those people is higher with a design specialist than with a development partner that's got design. And it breaks down the barriers far quicker emotionally. And that's not the only reason to go down the street, but actually that can help the e-commerce team and the core project team not have additional barriers to break down internally, because that's already been done for them. And the ideation around the insight and analysis piece of understanding like the user journey and the user experience piece, and factoring that into the art direction, the design process. I think there's not that many, although they do exist, development agencies who have that level of customer insight and user research skill thinking within the design process, no matter how good they might be at providing design, e-commerce design.
I think there's a lot of development agencies that are really good at design. But the other thing is, and I think sometimes you kind of need to let a business go like beyond the holy grail of like UX function and design. I guess like prioritize the creative side, because sometimes that is kind of what makes a business, or, makes a business special or makes a product special, etc. But I think it's always an interesting one.
I think you're right, because a lot of businesses do want a point of difference in their e-commerce site, because otherwise every site basically functionally and interaction design wise is identikit, but just with different branding and visuals, or maybe slightly different layouts and different size of layouts. And then it's very hard for people who are trying to wow their internal stakeholders or their investors with something creative. All right, let's go on now to the next discussion point, which is how do we get the design agency kickoff right? And for me, it starts with a very clear scoping planning call, where you go through a series of steps to get the design people in line with what your experts are, but also to get them to articulate how they are going to deliver the project. Interestingly, when we were talking about this episode, I'm going through this process with a premium brand at the moment in the beauty space. I'm looking at how we get the design partner aligned. But I guess let's hear your take first, Paul. I mean, Treva, what's your first steps when there's a new design partner? How do you get them where you think they need to be in terms of the overall e-commerce project?
Yeah, so I think there's a lot. When we have done this, there's been, and I probably didn't actually think about it as much when we were talking about this earlier as I did when you were just saying that. But I think the more preparation you can do up front, the better. So when we have had an external designer, because there's always going to be like, usually you'll have sessions where it's more about the brand division, the product, like that are more focused on like the creative side. And I think when you're trying, because you want to separate, you don't want to like restrict like the creativeness around design, but you do want to set parameters. And what we've always done is we've had like an internal workshop where we've essentially presented like a big spreadsheet with like different areas of the project, like functional areas that are going to be within scope. And then we started to build examples of like how things need to work. And then we've kind of kept them fairly isolated, but just started to like essentially like give the designers guidance around certain pieces of functionality. And then we've asked the client to then fill in an equivalent on their side. And then we've essentially kind of done a walkthrough with the designers. So I think that's pretty useful. And that might not be like core things like, like the image gallery on the PDP, for example, but it might be things like notifying me when back in stock or search or, filtering or whatever else. So I think that's really good. I think the holy grail of getting this right is probably still like you want to have. So this, actually, this is probably the next question more than anything else. But I think getting the two parties working together with like that crossover, like kind of bit in the middle, like Venn diagram type thing is very important. And then I think you've mentioned the roles and responsibilities. That's obviously really key. Anything, you can do around, you can kind of add from like a kind of platform perspective as well, just in terms of any restrictions on that side. So a good example is the Shopify checkout. Like that one always comes up, and you kind of have to reinforce that repeatedly to internal creative people and the design agency. And any kind of like bits of user experience, best practice you want to follow. Like again, you might want to have certain kind of guardrails around other aspects of the site that you kind of want to retain or not give them too much freedom around. But yeah, I think that's it. And then I guess the only other thing I would say is, I think in that process, if you can, having the two agencies speak to each other and build rapport helps, because the worst thing around this is if the agency resents, or if the two agencies resent each other. Like we actually did a project recently where there's a very creative-led full-service agency and a very technical-led full-service agency working together on a project, and we had to like really work to get them working together, and the end result was really strong. And actually, I think we benefited from both sides having like a little bit of or like having team members. So like, there is a designer on the dev side who, understands Figma inside out and stuff like that, and knows the right questions to ask. And equally on the design side, they've got a developer that's worked with Shopify in this instance. So they have a better idea of, how far they're pushing things from a development perspective. So that worked really well, but getting them working together, can be really challenging. So I think the earlier you can do that, and the earlier you can make like the rationale clearer and, get the two inputting, I think that will make them a bit more comfortable and prevent friction.
What is Amplience? In a word, it's freedom. The freedom to build a digital experience as limitless as your vision. Create, preview, schedule, and manage all your content in one easy place. Find out more at amplience.com. Amplience. Experience freedom.
Yeah, I think that's reducing friction is such an important point here. I think for me, the way I tend to approach it is I have an internal kickoff with the design agency first, before then doing the alignment piece with the development agency. So I actually just discussing this interestingly with a client who as well yesterday and today, and to make sure we get the design agency kickoff right. And they've done a lot of discovery work in terms of getting the right partner, who's a good fit for the business, who's got the right credentials and skills. Now let's get them understanding and in tune with the project. So I typically like to break it down into that meeting first, which is about, okay, who's your project team, what are their roles and responsibilities, and how we're going to work together on that angle. So it's clear who's doing what and why. Do you have a project manager? Not often. There'll probably be a client lead, and there'll be a lead. It's normally a lead designer. What's the process for the design phase? How many steps are there? What's done at each? Who's involved in each? What the outputs and deliverables are, so we know, because that then gives something tangible that the dev agency can review and go, okay, well, we're expecting this at stage 3, but they're saying that's not going to be there. Let's align. Then them to talk through the briefing process. What do they expect? What do they need in the brief? That can help us to identify any gaps where we think their thinking might not be as deep as is needed. And this comes back to your platform context. If we know that a platform like Shopify, where there are specific app limitations in terms of what the designs have to fit around, if they're not requesting and demanding specific things within the brief, like what are those key requirements, what are the apps you're using, we need to make sure that's flagged and dealt with up front. Then get them to specify what inputs they need from the business. So what information, what data, what insights they'll use. Then asking them to map out their standard alignment process from a UX UI design point of view. How do their designers work with the UX designers in the agency to align the design artifacts with the development process? Are there any potential issues there? Because if we can go through this process of the design agency, we can tease out any potential risks or gaps that we need to plug up front. Then down to you mentioned things like Figma tooling. What systems they're going to use? What will we have access to? What will devs have access to? What's their sign-off process, and how will they take those artifacts and turn them into finished outputs? So we make sure that they're thinking in terms of what a finished output is in line with what an agency needs, rather than, I've been in some projects where that hadn't been discussed, And then we sort of said, well, okay, this is the output format we need things. Oh no, we're just going to give you flat PDFs. And the dev agency saying, no, we don't work with PDFs. And then, then the final one, I think, is a really important conversation that a client should have with their design agency, even before they're speaking with getting them to speak to the dev agency, is what are their expectations of A, the client team, and B, the development agency that would make those parties good partners for the design agency. I think that's a really important question that's often underlooked, is what are your expectations? What are your needs? What will make us help you? How will we help you make this process smooth and efficient? So that might sound laborious, but I find that approach is quite an important one that gets everyone on the same page. And it also helps tease out where there might be gaps in thinking that we can plug before they tend to be massive issues in the project.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I agree with that. I think I'm maybe slightly eating into one of the other points, but I think the kind of things that can often come out in a kickoff is things like image handling, PDPs, because we've got luxury brands that want absolute the highest res, the crispest possible product imagery, and then you end up having more of a technical discussion around either the performance impact, but also it helps them to understand where they need to bring in third parties to support on that side as well. And then obviously the performance side as well around different approaches, and I think quite often there's kind of bits of compromise or middle ground where people might end up on that side as well. And accessibility is the other one.
Yeah, cool. Well, let's cover this one about aligning your dev partner with the design agency, and then we'll go back to what a good brief looks like from the client, because I still think that's an important point that we should cover. So what you've just said about making sure the development agency can walk through any platform limitations, constraints in the context of the requirements and the schedule of work they've got to deliver, that's hugely important, because it can help plug any gaps the design agency has specific to that platform, which you alluded to earlier. Also need to have that initiation meeting, as you said, that kind of what's it called, Venn diagram piece of what's the ratio. So where do the two meet, and what are the roles and responsibilities, so there's delineation and people aren't duplicating effort. Or even worse, where a development agency starts doing stuff that a design agency thought they were going to do, and the design agency gets pissed off, and you've got that issue, that conflict. Making sure that's clear is so important. And I think you made a point earlier before we start recording, which is let the design agency breathe. Basically, don't put too many constraints on their creativity. So managing the development agency, so they're not going in and imposing a way of working based on how they would do the designs. So maybe you can talk a little bit more about that, because I think that's a really important point.
Yeah, I think you almost, from my perspective, I think you almost want to let the design agency to a certain extent have a lot of freedom, apart from certain small areas, and then you want to bring in the development inputs, because although it might not be as efficient in terms of delivery and timeline, I think it allows people to see something that's maybe a bit more conceptual or creative ahead of the development agency starting to input, because you end up, like I say, often you'll end up with that bit of middle ground and kind of meeting in the middle at certain points. But I think it's important to see something that is a true kind of creative view of things, rather than them just being kind of what's the word, pushed in a certain direction, or and I think that to me is kind of how you end up with the best end result. And then you start to get the development agency kind of inputting around things like performance, accessibility, general kind of good practice, etc. And also the other, sometimes you'll have a specialist UX input. Sometimes that will come from internal and development agency, etc. And then you end up with collaboration around all of that stuff. But the initial brief to a design agency is usually more brand, visual, leveraging kind of assets and content and all of that kind of stuff. And you want to kind of, see things first before you then start to pull that more into the scope of the replatforming project.
Yeah, definitely. That's why I think to build on that, making sure that when you're aligning the two agencies, factoring into the project plan, development agency input at each stage of design when something's going to be produced, whether that's whatever form status it's in, before the final version is done and the design agency thinks it's signed off. So this is when a key page type is the home page, or when the overall site IA, information architecture, the navigation, the hierarchy, the taxonomy, that bit is done. Anything which is a core user journey, it could be like a subscription product, or it could be like loyalty, redemptions, etc. Anything where it can have a UX UI design and development implications, so that they can just sense check and feedback and nudge it in the right direction if there's anything that could cause problems in the development queues, or could add cost from a development point of view that the client doesn't want to incur later on. So let's go back to that point about getting the design agency brief fit for purpose. So talk us through, from your point of view, what makes a good design brief from a client. So this is the brief the client is creating to give to the design agency to make sure they know what's expected.
Yeah, so I think the first one is obviously kind of like goals and objectives, like what they want to achieve, the kind of key goals for the project, and probably more focused on that kind of visual identity kind of brand piece than the overall goals maybe. So I think that's really important. Depending on the scope, it can obviously be a lot broader if it's more, foundational stuff as well. I think as many kind of examples you can provide at different levels, maybe certain brands that communicate their value proposition really well, maybe certain brands that do content really well, like product page example, all of that kind of stuff, and then more specifics from there. I think that's always really good, just because it can kind of inspire designers or design agencies to have a better view of what needs to be in and out of scope and how long they need, etc.
And also what you don't like, because that's critical, because I've seen it where people have been given, this is what we like, and someone's come back with a design and people are going, I hate it because it's like this brand and we don't like that brand, but you didn't tell us. So
yeah, exactly. And I think the other thing, just detail around the business as well, key product, even things like the highest traffic product, all of that kind of stuff, key user journeys, as much kind of details you can have around that. And then if there are any kind of key technical restrictions, probably good to give early visibility of that kind of stuff as well. But it's kind of like any other brief, really. Just the more context you can give, and the more detail around what you're trying to achieve, the better someone can foresee what the scope should look like, how the project should work, who should be involved, how much it should cost, etc.
Yeah, exactly. And I always encourage customers to build out that insight piece of anything around, like you said, the key customer types, products, is put some data to it, show how that's changing over time, build out the segments. If you've got personas, whatever you've got where it can actually give people a qualification of what these segments and customers mean, who they are, what do they like, don't like. This including things like really important feedback through customer service, whether that's from live chat or emails or social things customers like, don't like, the things about how they tick and how they feel. And also key business insights. What are the key things the business has learned and knows about its brand, its products, and its customers that will help them better understand from a design point of view. So the more insight you can give, the better. But with the one caveat that if you give them 300 pages of data, you're going to slow them down massively. So you've got to think really practically what sort of data is going to be useful, what's going to inform them. Sometimes it's things like not just putting it into a document, but giving them a walkthrough of an analytics tool which is showing people's journeys through the site, where people drop out, getting them a feel for how people are currently using it, whether that that could be a content square, it could be it could be one of many tools that people are using to get their page level analytics. So sometimes that level of walkthrough, rather than just document everything, can be useful. And then I think you already touched on the requirements for key page types and user journeys. Take what's in the scope of work with your development agency and summarize the essential stuff that could influence the design thinking. As you said, stuff like notify me when back in stock. Has that plan been planned on PDPs? Things like paying installments. Have you got the right information so they know how that needs to be visualized in there? And that's got to be important information at that level of the user journey.
Yeah, absolutely.
It brings me on to I guess my last question. And I know there's probably loads more we could carry on talking about. We're trying to boil this down to a manageable episode for people. Is the whole? I guess it's the project management. It's the managing people, decisions, conflicts, etc. What are your tips for keeping this process afloat? Keeping it practical, so you haven't got like laborious amounts of project management slowing you down, but equally you've got the right level of control to keep it flowing well.
So I think overall you're going to probably have a lot more experience with organising things than I am, because
I'm dull.
But I think one thing that I've learned about the design process is that you're going to have a lot of very busy stakeholders involved. So like, brand team members, potentially a creative director, a founder, whoever else, CEO, whatever else. So I think, managing the diaries and getting everything scheduled like way in advance is always really important. Like anything like first passes or, final sign off, and you need time for like those stakeholders to review in a room together usually. So that one's really important. I think then, making sure you've got everything just mapped out very clearly from the start with all the different stakeholders, because you might end up with, 3 different external stakeholders and all your internal stakeholders as well. So that's a really important one. And I think for me, the biggest thing is going to be that crossover point where you've probably got like a 2, 3, 4 week window where it's like collaboration and, getting to a point of like getting suggestions from the agency and internal, applying revisions, next phase, etc., and getting that to be efficient so that it doesn't just go on and on and on essentially. So I think getting that ironed out at the start, making it clear, like, when you expect revisions to be turned around, like all of that kind of stuff. And also that like how you present them, how you get feedback. So I think they're all kind of really important bits.
100%. Yeah, the advanced scheduling bit, definitely, even if it's placeholders. And I know a few businesses I work with are really reticent to do this. It's like, oh no, we'll just do it near a time. And I keep saying to them, no, put a placeholder now. If you don't need it, you give people time back, they're happy. If people's diaries are rammed and then you ask for more time, they're annoyed. So yeah, 100% agree with you. And that comes back to the RACI matrix again, like who's responsible for what, who do you need? You don't need everyone in all of these milestone calls and meetings. Get the right people. The other bit is comms channels. You don't want to be dependent on having to schedule a call or a meeting for everything, or having an email, which is, I hate emails. They don't always land. They get lost in people's inboxes. Often people just send an email to 8 people, but they don't specify who needs to respond, or if they need to respond, to nothing gets done. Having things like Slack or Teams, whatever the tool is that you use in your business, so that you've got a Slack, for example, in Slack, we have a channel for the podcast, having a channel which has the design agency and the development agency and the client project team on for the design bit specifically, so that if the designers are like, oh, we really need to send check this to the agency, they don't have to come to you and say, can you get a call? Can we have a call? Just go straight, and you've got visibility. Anything that speeds up the comms and gets answers quicker, but is visible, so that if there's anything comes out that's a major action, you can document it and do something about it. And then my other point on this is escalation process. Really is, these projects can be complex. There are different stakeholders. They might not always see eye to eye. The question is, if something goes wrong, or if people can't agree and there's a disagreement that needs to be resolved, what's the escalation? Who is the decision authority to resolve it, where they can step in and go, right, okay, I've listened to both sides. This is our decision. Let's move forward. Have that clear and have everyone agree and buy into it. Because sometimes decisions have to be made that not everyone agrees with in order to keep the project moving, so that you don't end up at a standstill. It's just part and parcel of project management. So getting everyone to be grown up about it from the start is important. Otherwise, you end up with friction, as you alluded to earlier, and arguments.
Yeah, I agree.
Anything else to add? I feel like we've probably covered quite a bit in a relatively short period of time.
Yeah, no, I think, yeah, exactly. Yeah, we covered a lot. I think, yeah, the only other, like we talked about kind of governing, accessibility, SEO, like they're the only other 2 where you need like a layer of governance. But to be honest, I think that's usually pretty manageable, and it's not the end of the world if you need to make some smaller changes further down the line, but obviously good inputs to have through the process. But yeah, I think we've covered most things.
Yeah. Excellent. Well, so for those of you who have stayed to the end, I hope you found it interesting. I hope you found it useful. Feel free to disagree, or feel free to reach out and tell us what you've learned about aligning design and development partners. What did we miss? What else would you recommend to people? We'd love to hear. There's no 100% right answer on this, and we're always learning as well. And do keep an ear out for the next episode. We drop one every Tuesday. And if you're not a subscriber, please do. We send episode alerts every week. And we would absolutely love a rating on YouTube, Apple, or Spotify. Thanks very much. Until next week. For more information on this topic, head over to replatform.fm for our audio podcasts. To discuss a project, or if you'd like to chat about any of the topics covered in this episode in more detail, please reach out to myself, James Gurd, or my co-host Paul Rogers via LinkedIn and Twitter. Thanks again for listening, and keep your ears peeled for the next episode.